The restaurant was the kind of place where even the water came with a pedigree. Crystal glasses, white tablecloths pressed so flat they looked painted on, and waiters who moved like shadows. Elena Vance sat alone at a corner table, her fingers wrapped around the stem of a wine glass she hadn't touched. She was checking her phone for the third time in 2 minutes when the chair across from her scraped back. She looked up, ready to deliver the polite smile she'd perfected for these occasions. Another blind date, another well-meaning setup by her assistant, who seemed convinced that Elena's problem was simply not meeting the right people. But the man standing there wasn't reaching for her hand or launching into some rehearsed greeting. He was just looking at her. Mid-30s, maybe. Dark hair with a few early grays at the temples. A face that wasn't handsome in any obvious way. Nose slightly crooked. Jaw a little too sharp, but somehow memorable. He wore a simple navy blazer over a white shirt, no tie, and his hands were the kind of rough that didn't come from golf courses. "Elena," he said. Not a question. "Yes. You must be." She glanced at her phone again. "Daniel." He sat down slowly, the way someone sits when they're not sure they should stay. His eyes never left her face. There was something in them. Not anger exactly, but something heavy, something patient and old. "You don't remember me, do you?" The words hit her strangely. She studied his face again, searching for something familiar. The shape of his brow, the small scar near his left ear. Nothing clicked. "I'm sorry," she said. "Should I?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up the menu, scanned it without reading, and set it down again. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. 23 years ago, Riverdale Middle School, Mrs. Patterson's 7th grade class. Elena felt something shift in her chest, a door opening somewhere deep, letting in cold air from a room she'd locked a long time ago. "You sat in the back row," he continued. "Always had the right answer, but never raised your hand. Except once." She set down her glass. Her fingers were trembling slightly, and she hated that. "I don't know what you're talking about." But she did. Somewhere beneath the boardrooms and the quarterly reports and the penthouse apartment with its view of the city skyline, she knew exactly what he was talking about. If you're the kind of person who stays for stories that go deeper than you expect, consider subscribing. Now, let's go back to where this really started. 23 years earlier, Elena Vance was not Elena Vance at all. She was Elena Marsh, 13 years old, with second-hand clothes and a mother who worked double shifts at a textile factory. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Riverdale, the side where the streetlights flickered and the buses ran late. Her father had left when she was 6. Not dramatically. No slamming doors or shouted goodbyes. He just went to work one morning and didn't come back. Her mother never spoke about him after that, and Elena learned early that some questions weren't worth asking. School was her escape. Not because she loved it. The social hierarchies were brutal, and she had exactly 0 friends, but because it was the one place where being smart actually counted for something. She could disappear into textbooks and tests, and nobody cared that her sneakers had holes, or that she ate free lunch in the corner of the cafeteria. 7th grade was the year everything got harder. Her mother's hours got cut. The apartment building changed owners, and rent went up. Elena started seeing the numbers in her mother's face, the math of survival that children aren't supposed to understand but always do. Daniel Reyes sat 3 rows ahead of her in Mrs. Patterson's class. He was the kind of kid who made everything look easy. Naturally athletic, effortlessly popular, with parents who showed up to every school event in matching sweaters and drove a car that didn't make strange noises. He wasn't cruel. Elena had to give him that. He didn't participate in the whispered jokes about her clothes or the way she flinched when someone got too close. He just didn't see her at all, which was fine. Being invisible was safe. The problem started in October when Mrs. Patterson announced a group project on community history. Partners would be assigned randomly. Elena watched the teacher pull names from a hat, her stomach tightening with each pairing. Daniel Reyes and Elena Marsh. The silence that followed was brief but sharp. Elena saw Daniel's friends exchange looks, the kind of looks that said better you than me. Daniel himself, just shrugged and glanced back at her with a neutral expression that somehow felt worse than disgust. They met after school that first day in the library. Daniel dropped into the chair across from her and pulled out a notebook. "So," he said, "community history. Any ideas?" She had about 15 ideas, actually. She'd been researching Riverdale's founding since 3rd grade, fascinated by the textile mills that had built the town and then abandoned it. But something about his tone, casual, almost bored, made her hesitate. "We could write about the mills," she said carefully. "The mills? Like the old factory buildings?" "They're historically significant. The Riverdale mills employed half the town for almost 60 years before they closed in the 80s. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't read his expression. "Okay," he said finally. "Sure, mills it is." They worked together twice a week for the next month. Daniel was not, as Elena had assumed, stupid. He asked good questions. He took decent notes. But he was also distracted, constantly checking his phone and making excuses to leave early. She ended up doing most of the research herself, staying late at the library until the overhead lights flickered their warning. The project was due the 2nd week of November. The night before, Elena stayed up until 2 in the morning putting together their presentation. She'd found old photographs from the Historical Society, interviews with former workers, even a grainy video clip from a local news archive. It was good, maybe the best work she'd ever done. The next morning, she arrived at school early with everything printed and organized in a neat folder. Daniel was already there, surrounded by his friends near the main entrance. He saw her coming and detached himself from the group. "Hey," he said, "about the project. I have everything ready. The boards, the photos, Yeah, about that." He ran a hand through his hair. "Coach called an emergency practice this morning. The game on Saturday got moved up. I can't do the presentation." Elena stared at him. "What do you mean you can't do it?" "I mean I won't be there. You can handle it, right? You did most of the work anyway." There were a dozen things she wanted to say. That she'd spent weeks on this. That Mrs. Patterson had specifically said both partners needed to present. That she'd barely slept and her hands were shaking from exhaustion, and she couldn't afford a bad grade because scholarships didn't care about emergency basketball practices. But Daniel was already backing away, already returning to his friends, already forgetting she existed. "Thanks, Elena. I owe you one." He didn't owe her one. He owed her approximately 60 hours of work and the anxiety attack she was about to have in the girls' bathroom. But she just stood there holding her folder, watching him disappear through the gym doors. Mrs. Patterson gave her a B-. "The research was excellent," she said, with a particular disappointment teachers reserve for students they expected more from. "But a group project requires collaboration." Where was Daniel? Elena didn't answer. She took the grade and walked back to her seat and stared at the wall until the bell rang. That might have been the end of it. An unremarkable story about an unremarkable injustice, the kind that happens to kids like Elena every day. But 3 weeks later, something else happened. The Winter Talent Show. Riverdale Middle School's talent show was legendary for all the wrong reasons. Kids singing off-key pop songs, awkward magic tricks, one memorable year with the ventriloquist dummy that gave half the audience nightmares. Nobody took it seriously. It was just another excuse to get out of class. Elena wasn't planning to participate. She wasn't planning to even attend. But that year, Mrs. Patterson had added a new category: academic presentations. Students could present original research on any topic and compete for a $50 prize. $50 was a lot of money. $50 was new shoes and bus fare and maybe even a book that wasn't from a library. So Elena signed up. She took her mill project, the full version, not the one she condensed for class, and turned it into something bigger. She included her mother's stories about working in the textile factory across town. She found documents about the labor disputes of the 1970s, the families who'd lost everything when the mills closed. She made it personal in a way that Mrs. Patterson's assignment hadn't allowed. The night of the talent show, she stood backstage with her poster boards and her index cards and her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The auditorium was packed. Parents, teachers, half the student body forced to attend by various participation requirements. She was the second to last act, squeezed between a girl doing interpretive dance and the grand finale of the drama club's original one-act play. When they called her name, she walked out on shaking legs. The lights were too bright. The microphone squealed. She could see Daniel sitting in the third row with his basketball teammates, their attention already wandering. She began to speak. The first few minutes were rough. Her voice cracked. She lost her place twice. But then something shifted. The auditorium got quieter. People stopped whispering. She was talking about her grandmother, who'd worked at the Riverdale Mills for 37 years and never missed a day until the day they closed the doors without warning. She was talking about the families who'd built this town and been forgotten. She was talking about history that wasn't in textbooks, because it belonged to people who didn't write books. By the time she finished, her hands had stopped shaking. The silence stretched for a long moment, long enough that she thought she'd failed completely, and then someone started clapping. It wasn't thunderous applause. It wasn't a standing ovation, but it was real, and it lasted longer than polite, and for the first time in her life, Elena felt seen. She won the $50. More importantly, she won something she didn't have a name for yet, a sense that her voice mattered, that she could make people listen. But here's what she didn't know. After the show, as students filed out and parents collected their children and the janitor started folding chairs, Daniel Reyes was still sitting in the third row, and he was still looking at the spot where she'd stood. The following Monday, he tried to talk to her. She saw him coming across the cafeteria, weaving between tables with what looked like purpose. She gathered her things and left before he reached her. He tried again on Tuesday and Wednesday. Each time, she found a way to disappear, into the bathroom, into the library, into a crowd of students heading the opposite direction. By Thursday, he'd stopped trying. And 2 months later, Elena's mother got a better job in a city 300 miles away. They packed up the apartment in one weekend, loaded everything into a rental van, and drove away from Riverdale without looking back. Elena never thought about Daniel Reyes again, or at least, she told herself she didn't. Now, 23 years later, she was sitting across from him in a restaurant that cost more per plate than her mother had made in a week. The girl who'd worn second-hand clothes had become the woman who'd built a logistics empire from nothing. Elena Vance, founder and CEO of Vantage Global, with a net worth that made newspapers stumble over the number of zeros. She'd earned every cent of it. Every sleepless night, every calculated risk, every relationship she'd sacrificed on the altar of ambition. And she'd never, not once, needed anyone's help. Daniel was watching her process this. He hadn't ordered anything. The waiter hovered nearby, uncertain, and Daniel waved him away without breaking eye contact. "You remember now," he said. "I remember a group project. I remember doing all the work while you went to basketball practice." "That's what you remember." That's what happened. Something flickered across his face. Pain, maybe. Or disappointment. It was hard to tell. "Do you remember the talent show?" Elena's jaw tightened. "I remember winning $50 for a presentation you couldn't be bothered to participate in." "I was there. A lot of people were there. I was there. Listening. Actually listening." He leaned forward slightly. "You talked about your grandmother. About the mills closing. About how nobody remembered the people who'd actually built this town. And I sat there thinking." He stopped. Started again. "I sat there thinking that I'd spent a month working next to you, and I had no idea who you were." Elena didn't know what to say to that. She picked up her wine glass, set it down again. "I tried to find you after," Daniel continued, "to talk to you. But you kept running away, and then you were gone. My mother got a new job. We moved. I know. I asked Mrs. Patterson. She said you transferred, but she didn't know where." The idea of Daniel Reyes asking about her, asking anyone about her, was so foreign that Elena almost laughed. "Why would you care?" "Because you were the most interesting person I'd ever met, and I was too stupid to realize it until you stood on that stage and made the whole room go quiet." The waiter appeared again, more insistent this time. Elena ordered the salmon without looking at the menu. Daniel ordered the same. "So," she said when they were alone again, 23 years later, and this is how we meet. My assistant sets me up on a blind date, and it turns out to be you." "Not exactly blind. Your assistant is my cousin's wife." Elena blinked. "Margot. Her husband's my first cousin. She mentioned she worked for someone named Elena who used to live in Riverdale. I asked a few questions. She thought it might be nice if we reconnected." "Nice," Elena repeated. The word felt strange in her mouth. "You tracked me down through my assistant because you felt guilty about a school project from 7th grade?" "That's not why." "Then why?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. The restaurant murmured around them, silverware clinking, low conversations, the distant sound of a cork being pulled. When he spoke again, his voice was different, slower, more careful. "After you left, I spent a long time thinking about that presentation, about what you said, about the mills and the families and the people nobody remembered." He turned his water glass in his hands. "My father worked at one of those mills. Not in Riverdale. We moved there when I was 10, but across the state. He worked there for 20 years, and when they closed, he got 2 weeks severance and a handshake." Elena felt something shift in her chest again. That door opening wider. "He died when I was in college," Daniel continued. "Heart attack. He was 53. And the whole time I was growing up, I never asked him about his work. Never asked what it was like, what he felt when they closed the plant, how he kept going after that. I was too busy with sports and friends and pretending we were something we weren't." He looked at her directly. "Your presentation made me think about that. Made me realize I'd been so focused on fitting in that I'd ignored where I actually came from. So I went home that summer and I sat down with my dad and I asked him questions, real questions, and he told me stories I'd never heard, about his life, his struggles, his hopes for our family." The salmon arrived. Neither of them touched it. "I became a social worker because of that summer," Daniel said. "Because of those conversations. Because you stood on a stage in a middle school auditorium and reminded a room full of teenagers that ordinary people's lives matter." Elena didn't trust her voice. She reached for her wine and took a long, slow sip. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel responsible," he added. "I'm telling you because I spent 23 years wondering what happened to the girl who changed how I saw the world. And now I know." "What do you know?" "That you built an empire. That you're successful beyond anything I could have imagined. That you're sitting across from me in a restaurant that costs more than my monthly salary. And you look—" He paused. "You look exhausted, Elena. And I don't mean tired." Something cracked in her expression. Just for a second. Then the mask slid back into place. "You don't know anything about my life." "You're right. I don't. That's kind of my point." The silence stretched between them. Elena looked at her plate, at the perfectly arranged salmon, and suddenly she wasn't hungry at all. "This was a mistake," she said. "Coming here. Whatever Margot thought she was doing. She thought you might want to have dinner with someone who wasn't trying to pitch you an investment." The words landed harder than they should have. Elena thought about her calendar, meetings and galas and networking events that bled into each other until she couldn't remember the last time she'd had a conversation that wasn't transactional. "I don't need saving," she said, "if that's what this is." "It's not. It's dinner." He picked up his fork. "And if you want, it can just be dinner. No deep conversations. No history. Just two people eating overpriced fish." Against her better judgment, Elena laughed. It was a short, surprised sound, almost rusty from disuse. "The fish is pretty good," she admitted. "Should be, for what they charge." They ate in silence for a few minutes. The tension in Elena's shoulders began to ease, incrementally, like a fist slowly unclenching. "Tell me about being a social worker," she said finally. Daniel looked up. "You really want to know?" "I asked, didn't I?" So he told her. Not the sanitized version for donors and board meetings, but the real version. The kids he couldn't help, the systems that failed, the small victories that kept him going when everything else felt impossible. He worked with foster youth transitioning out of care, helping them find jobs and housing and some semblance of stability. Most people age out at 18 with nothing, he said. No family, no savings, no support. We try to bridge that gap. It doesn't always work. What happens when it doesn't? They fall through the cracks, end up homeless, incarcerated. Worse, he set down his fork. But sometimes, not always, but sometimes, they find their footing. They build lives. And you get a phone call 5 years later from someone who's going to college, or starting a family, or just holding down a steady job. And they say thank you. And that's enough. That's more than enough. Elena thought about her own career. The congratulatory calls, the magazine features, the investors fighting for a piece of her company. None of it had ever felt like enough. That must be nice, she said quietly, knowing you actually help people. You help people too. Your company employs, what, 15,000 workers? 16,800. 16,800 people with jobs, healthcare, stability. That's not nothing. It's not the same. Why not? She didn't have an answer for that. Or maybe she did. But it was buried too deep to excavate over dinner. They talked for another 2 hours. The restaurant emptied around them, couples leaving, staff quietly resetting tables, and they barely noticed. Elena found herself telling stories she hadn't told anyone. Her mother's second marriage to a man who turned out to be kind, the scholarship that got her through college, the business partner who stole her first company, and the determination that built her second one. Daniel listened. Not the way people usually listen to her, waiting for an opening to ask for something, but the way someone listens when they're genuinely curious, when they want to understand. By the time the check arrived, Elena had forgotten to guard her words. She'd forgotten, temporarily, that vulnerability was weakness and weakness was fatal. She felt light in a way she couldn't explain. Same time next week. Daniel asked as they stood outside the restaurant, the city humming around them. Elena hesitated. Every instinct she developed over 20 years of business was screaming at her to say no, to protect herself, to maintain the boundaries that had kept her safe. Why do you want to see me again? Because you're still the most interesting person I've ever met. He smiled, a real smile, not the performative kind she saw in boardrooms. And I have a feeling there's a lot more to the story. She should have said no. She should have gotten in her car and driven back to her penthouse and forgotten this ever happened. Okay, she said instead. Same time next week. The weeks that followed were strange and unsettling in ways Elena couldn't fully articulate. She'd built her life around predictability, controlled outcomes, calculated risks, relationships that served strategic purposes. Daniel fit none of those categories. He didn't want anything from her. That was the most disorienting part. He didn't want an investment, a donation, a connection to her network. He wanted to eat dinner and talk about their weeks and argue about whether pineapple belonged on pizza. You're a monster, he said one evening, watching her pick pineapple off a slice. It's already there. It's already touched the cheese. The pineapple touched the cheese. The cheese remains innocent. That's not how contamination works. That's exactly how contamination works. Ask any chemist. You're not a chemist. I took chemistry. Once. They went to different restaurants each week. Elena's choice one time, Daniel's the next. His choices were always small neighborhood places, with plastic menus and servers who called everyone honey. Hers were sleek establishments with tasting menus and wine pairings. She liked his restaurants better. The food was worse, objectively, but the atmosphere was warmer. People laughed there. Families crowded into booths. Old couples shared desserts without speaking, communicating in the silent language of decades. Why did you never get married? Daniel asked one night, over plates of decent but not great Thai food. Who says I didn't? Your assistant. According to Margot, you've been single for approximately forever. Margot talks too much. She worries about you. Elena pushed a piece of chicken around her plate. I was engaged once. 8 years ago. It didn't work out. What happened? I work too much. He got tired of coming second. He left. End of story. It was more complicated than that, obviously. Michael had been handsome and smart, and exactly the kind of man who looked right in family Christmas photos. He'd also been jealous of her success in ways he'd refused to acknowledge, picking fights over nothing, making snide comments about her hours and her income, and the fact that her name was bigger than his. But the bottom line was true. She'd worked too much. She'd chosen the company over the relationship. Do you regret it? Daniel asked. Which part? The engagement or the ending? Either. Both. Elena considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. I regret that I couldn't be what he wanted, but I don't regret building what I built. What about now? What do you mean? Are you still building, or are you just maintaining? The question hit differently than she expected. She thought about her days, the same meetings, the same decisions, the same problems, wearing different faces. The company ran itself now, mostly. Her presence was symbolic. Important, but not necessary. I don't know, she admitted. I haven't thought about it. Maybe you should. She didn't answer, but she didn't forget the question either. It lodged somewhere beneath her ribs and stayed there. On their 8th dinner, Daniel invited her to a fundraiser for his organization. It's nothing fancy, he said quickly. Just a thing at the community center. Finger food and silent auction. You absolutely don't have to come. I'll come. Really? Is that so surprising? A little, yeah. It's going to be very different from what you're used to. He wasn't wrong. The community center was a squat brick building with fluorescent lights and folding tables covered in paper cloths. The crowd was a mix of social workers, former foster kids, and community members who'd wandered in out of curiosity. The food was store-bought cookies and vegetables with ranch dip. Elena wore a simple dress, simple for her, which still cost more than most of the silent auction items, and felt conspicuously out of place. People stared. A few whispered. She heard her name float through the room more than once. But Daniel stayed close, introducing her to colleagues and clients and the teenagers who worked at the center after school. And gradually, the stares became smiles. The whispers became conversations. You're not what I expected, said a young woman named Jasmine, who'd aged out of foster care 2 years earlier and was now studying to be a nurse. When they said some big CEO was coming, I don't know. I thought you'd be all stiff and corporate. I can be stiff and corporate, Elena said. I'm making an effort. Jasmine laughed. Fair enough. Later, Elena found herself standing in front of a wall covered in photographs. Young faces, mostly. Some smiling, some serious, some caught mid-laugh. Each photo had a small card beneath it with a name and a story. Where they'd come from, where they were going, what they'd achieved. The success wall, Daniel said, appearing beside her. Everyone who's come through our program and built a stable life. There are a lot of them. Not enough. But yes, a lot. Elena studied the faces. Some of them reminded her of herself at that age. Hungry, determined, trying to escape circumstances they hadn't chosen. I want to help, she heard herself say. Daniel looked at her carefully. What kind of help? I don't know yet. Something meaningful. Not just writing a check. Checks are meaningful. They're easy. I want to do something that matters. He was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. That real smile again. The one that made him look younger. Let me introduce you to some people. What started as a casual offer became something bigger. Elena began meeting with Daniel's team, learning about the specific gaps in services for foster youth. She discovered that many of them struggled to find employment because they had no professional references, no interview clothes, no understanding of workplace norms. We do what we can, said Maria, the program director, but we don't have the resources or connections for meaningful job placement. Most of them end up in minimum wage positions that don't lead anywhere. Elena thought about her own company. 16,800 employees across dozens of locations. Entry-level positions that required minimal experience. Training programs that could build real skills. What if I created a pipeline she asked. Dedicated positions for program graduates, mentorship, real career paths. Maria's eyes widened. That would change everything. I need to talk to my board, work out the details. But if we could start with 10 positions, see how it goes. 10 positions would be more than we've ever placed in a single company. Elena felt something spark in her chest. Not the familiar satisfaction of a successful deal, but something warmer, something that felt like purpose. She threw herself into the project with the same intensity she'd brought to building her empire. Within 2 months, she created a formal partnership between Vantage Global and the Foster Youth Program. The board resisted at first. It's not cost-effective. One of them complained, but Elena pushed through. She learned long ago that boards only cared about costs when they didn't see the larger picture. The first cohort started in the spring. 6 young people between 18 and 22, placed in entry-level positions across the company's logistics operations. Elena insisted on meeting each of them personally. Marcus was 19, quiet, with the kind of wariness that came from too many broken promises. He'd been in 7 foster homes before aging out. His previous employment history was a string of fast food jobs that never lasted more than a few months. I'm not good at this, he said during their meeting, not meeting her eyes. Job stuff. Following rules. I don't know why you picked me. Daniel picked you, Elena said, and Daniel doesn't waste his time on people who aren't worth it. What if I mess up? Then we figure out what happened and try again. That's how it works. Marcus looked at her for the first time. His expression was skeptical but also, underneath, hopeful. It was the same expression Elena had seen in her own mirror, a long time ago. Okay, he said. I'll try. The first few months were not smooth. 2 of the 6 hires struggled with attendance and had to be counseled. One quit after 3 weeks, overwhelmed by the adjustment. But the others held on, slowly finding their footing, learning the rhythms of professional life. Elena found herself checking in more than necessary. She'd review their performance reports, ask managers for updates, sometimes stop by the warehouse facilities just to see how they were doing. It wasn't efficient. It wasn't scalable. But she couldn't seem to stop. You're getting attached, Daniel observed one evening. I'm monitoring my investment. Sure. That's why you know Marcus's birthday and have opinions about his college applications. Elena didn't bother denying it. He's smart. He could do more than warehouse logistics. He could, and thanks to you, he has options he wouldn't have had otherwise. Daniel reached across the table and took her hand. It was the first time he'd touched her since they'd started these dinners, and the contact sent an unexpected warmth through her fingers. I'm proud of you, he said. For what? For caring. I know that doesn't come naturally. She should have pulled her hand away. She should have deflected with a joke or changed the subject. Instead, she turned her palm up and let her fingers interlock with his. It's starting to, she said. Their relationship shifted after that. Not dramatically. Elena wasn't built for dramatic shifts, but gradually. Dinners became phone calls, became texts throughout the day. Daniel started leaving a toothbrush at her apartment. She started keeping his favorite cereal in her kitchen. It was terrifying. You sure about this? She asked one morning, watching him make coffee in her space-age espresso machine. I'm difficult. I work too much. I have control issues. I've noticed. And you're okay with that? Daniel turned to face her, leaning against the counter. I'm not expecting you to change who you are. I'm just asking you to let me in sometimes. What if I can't? Then we'll figure it out. That's how it works, remember? She didn't have a response for that. She'd spent so long building walls that she'd forgotten people could choose to climb them. The crisis, when it came, arrived without warning. 6 months into their relationship, Elena's company faced a hostile takeover attempt. A private equity firm had been quietly acquiring shares, and by the time her board noticed, they controlled nearly 30%. Elena went into battle mode. 18-hour days, emergency meetings, lawyers and investment bankers, filling every minute. She stopped returning Daniel's calls, stopped coming home at reasonable hours, Stopped eating meals that weren't delivered to conference rooms. It lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of war, sleepless and brutal. In the end, she won. A complicated maneuver involving white knight investors and shareholder rights plans. But the victory felt hollow. On the night the deal closed, she finally called Daniel. "The takeover's over," she said. "We're safe." "I know. I saw the news." His voice was careful, neutral. "I'm sorry I disappeared. Things were intense. I understand." But he didn't sound like he understood. He sounded tired, distant, like he'd been standing at a door for 3 weeks and finally stopped knocking. "Can I see you?" she asked. "Not tonight. I have an early morning tomorrow." "Tomorrow then?" A pause. "Elena, I think we need to talk." The words hit her like cold water. We need to talk. The prelude to every ending she'd ever experienced. "I know I handled this badly," she said quickly. "I know I shut you out. But the company. It's not about the company." "Then what is it about?" Another pause. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "It's about you. About the fact that when things got hard, your first instinct was to push me away. You didn't ask for help. You didn't let me support you. You just vanished. Like I was someone you could put on hold until the crisis was over." "That's not. It's exactly what happened. And I don't blame you for it. I know you've spent your whole life handling things alone. But I can't be in a relationship where I'm only allowed in during the easy parts." Elena's throat tightened. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying I need you to decide what you want. Not just from me, from your life. Because right now, it feels like you're running the same race you've been running since you were 13. And I don't know if there's room in that race for anyone else." The phone call ended shortly after. Not with a breakup. Daniel was too kind for that. But with an unresolved question hanging in the space between them. Elena went home to her empty penthouse and stood at the window, looking at the city she'd conquered. Lights stretched to the horizon. Buildings she'd financed. Streets filled with trucks bearing her company's logo. She had everything she'd ever wanted. And she had never felt more alone. The next week was a blur of introspection. Elena went through the motions, meetings, calls, decisions. But her mind was elsewhere. She kept thinking about Daniel's words. About the race she'd been running since middle school. About what it would mean to stop. On the 3rd day, she called Margot into her office. "Cancel my meetings for the rest of the week," she said. Margot blinked. All of them. All of them. I need to take some time." Is everything okay?" "No," Elena said honestly. "But I think it might be." She drove to Riverdale that afternoon. She hadn't been back in 23 years. Hadn't even considered it. But now the pull was irresistible. She wanted to see the place where everything started. The town had changed and hadn't changed. The mills were still standing, converted now into loft apartments and artisan shops. The east side had gentrified somewhat, better streetlights, newer buses, but the bones were the same. She found her old apartment building, now painted a cheerful yellow, and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, just looking. A woman came out the front door, saw Elena standing there, and gave her a curious look. "Can I help you?" "I used to live here," Elena said. "A long time ago." The woman's expression softened. "Really? Which unit?" "2B, on the 2nd floor." "That's my place now." The woman hesitated. "Would you like to see it? If that's not too weird." It should have been weird. It was weird. But Elena found herself saying yes anyway. The apartment was different. Of course it was. But the layout was the same. The kitchen where her mother had made breakfast before dawn. The window where Elena had done her homework, by the streetlight. The corner where she'd slept on a mattress on the floor. "It's small," the woman said apologetically. "But the landlord's been good about repairs." "It's exactly how I remember it." Elena's voice caught. "We didn't have much back then. But my mother made it feel like home." "She sounds like a good woman." She is. Elena smiled. "Thank you for showing me." On her way out of town, she stopped at the middle school. It looked smaller than she remembered. Most childhood places did. but the auditorium was unchanged. She stood in the back row and looked at the stage where she'd given a presentation that changed 2 lives. Her phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. "Margot says you're in Riverdale. Everything okay?" She typed back, "Figuring some things out. Can I call you tonight?" "Always." She drove back to the city as the sun set, thinking about choices, about the walls she'd built and the people she'd kept outside them, about what it meant to let someone in, really let them in, when your whole life had been about protecting yourself. That night, she called Daniel. "I went to Riverdale," she said. "I saw our old school, the apartment where I grew up, the whole town. That must have been intense. It was—" She took a breath. "You were right. About the race. I've been running so long I forgot why I started." "Why did you start?" "Because I was scared. Because we had nothing, and I never wanted to feel that vulnerable again. So I built walls. Made myself untouchable. Told myself that independence was the same thing as strength. And now I think maybe strength is knowing when to ask for help. Knowing when to let someone see the parts you're not proud of." She paused. "I'm not good at this, Daniel. Relationships. Vulnerability. Needing people. But I want to try. For real this time." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that she began to worry. "I'm still here," he said finally. "I've been here the whole time." "I know. I'm sorry it took me so long to notice." "What happens now?" "I don't know. But I'd like to figure it out together. If you're willing." Another pause. Then, "Same restaurant? Tomorrow night?" She felt something release in her chest. A tension she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was there. "Same restaurant. Tomorrow night." The months that followed were not a fairy tale. Elena didn't suddenly become a different person. She still worked too much. She still struggled with asking for help. She still had moments when her first instinct was to retreat behind her walls. But she kept trying. She left the office early sometimes, even when it felt wrong. She called Daniel when things were hard, not just when they were easy. She let him see her failures, the deals that fell through, the decisions she regretted, the days when she doubted everything she'd built. And slowly, incrementally, things began to shift. The foster youth program expanded. Marcus finished his first year at the company and applied for a supervisor position. 3 more cohorts came through, with a success rate that made even the skeptics take notice. Elena found herself spending more time at the community center, mentoring and coaching, and doing work that mattered in ways her board couldn't measure. "You've changed," her mother said during one of their monthly video calls. Her mother lived in Arizona now, retired, still sharp-eyed at 72. "Have I?" "You smile more. You talk about people, not just numbers. You mentioned this Daniel person 3 times already, and you haven't even noticed." Elena laughed. "Margot says the same thing. She thinks I've gone soft." "Nothing soft about caring, baby. That's just growing up." 2 years after their first dinner, Daniel asked Elena to marry him. It wasn't a grand gesture. No flash mob or skywriting or hidden cameras. They were sitting in the small Thai restaurant, sharing pad thai and arguing about pineapple, when he pulled out a simple ring and said, "I'd really like to spend the rest of my life with you. What do you think?" She thought about the girl she'd been, the one who stood on a stage in a middle school auditorium and made a roomful of strangers listen, the one who'd been invisible and had refused to stay that way. She thought about the woman she'd become, the empire builder, the workaholic, the untouchable CEO with a penthouse and a broken engagement and a heart she'd locked in a vault. And she thought about who she was becoming now. Someone softer, someone braver, someone who'd learned, finally and perfectly, that letting people in wasn't weakness. It was the only thing that mattered. "I think yes," she said. The wedding was small. 50 people at the community center, paper tablecloths and store-bought cookies. Just like the fundraiser where everything had started to change. Marcus gave a toast that made everyone cry. Margot served as maid of honor and managed to only mention her matchmaking skills 3 times. Daniel's cousin looked smug all evening. Elena wore a simple white dress and comfortable shoes. Her mother walked her down the aisle, moving slowly, but refusing to use a cane. "I've waited a long time for this," she said at the altar, eyes bright. "So have I," Elena whispered back. "I just didn't know it." The reception spilled out onto the sidewalk as the sun went down. Children from the program ran between tables. Staff members danced badly to worse music. It was loud and chaotic, and absolutely nothing like the elegant events Elena had attended for 2 decades. It was perfect. Late in the evening, as the crowd thinned and the cleanup began, Daniel found Elena standing near the success wall. New photos had been added since her first visit. More faces, more stories, more lives transformed by small acts of patience and care. "Quite a journey," he said, slipping his arm around her waist. "From 7th grade to this. I still can't believe you remember me all those years. I couldn't forget you. You were the girl who stood up in front of everyone and told the truth about who we were and where we came from. That takes courage." It didn't feel like courage. It felt like desperation. Sometimes they're the same thing. She leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his body against hers. Outside, the city hummed its endless song, traffic and voices, and a million small sounds of lives being lived. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For asking if I remembered you. For not giving up when I ran away. For seeing something in me that I didn't know was there." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Thank you for letting me see it." They stood there for a long moment, surrounded by photographs of people who'd been given second chances. People who'd started with nothing and built something meaningful. People who'd learned, as Elena had learned, as they were all still learning, that the measure of a life wasn't what you achieved. It was who you let in along the way. 1 year after the wedding, Elena stepped down as CEO. She stayed on as board chair, still involved, still shaping the company's direction, but the day-to-day running passed to someone else. It was time. The foster youth program had become her primary focus now. What started as 10 positions had grown into a national initiative, with branches in 15 cities, and a waiting list of companies wanting to participate. Elena traveled constantly, speaking at conferences, meeting with legislators, pushing for systemic changes that would help kids long before they aged out of the system. It was harder than running a company, less glamorous. The victories were smaller and the setbacks more frequent. But every time she got a phone call from a former program participant, someone who'd found stable housing, finished school, started a family, she remembered why she'd started. "You're making a difference," Daniel told her one evening, as they sat on the porch of the modest house they'd bought in a neighborhood that reminded Elena of where she'd grown up. "You know that, right? Sometimes I wonder, then stop wondering. I've watched you change the trajectory of hundreds of lives. You gave them what nobody gave you, a chance to be seen." She thought about that, about the 13-year-old girl who'd wanted nothing more than to be visible, to matter, to have her voice heard, and about the strange, circuitous path that had led from that auditorium stage to here. "I used to think success meant never needing anyone," she said, "building walls so high nobody could hurt me. And now I think the walls were the problem. They kept the bad stuff out, but they kept everything else out too." Daniel took her hand. His fingers were still rough, still the hands of someone who did real work in the real world. She loved those hands. "So what's the alternative?" "I don't know. Building bridges instead of walls, maybe. Letting people in even when it's scary. Trusting that asking for help isn't the same as being weak." She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she'd learned to look at people now. Not calculating their usefulness or measuring their threat level, but just seeing them, seeing him. "You taught me that," she said. "All of it. I didn't teach you anything. I just reminded you of something you already knew." "Same thing." "Not really, but I'll take the credit anyway." They sat together as the sun set, watching the neighborhood settle into evening. Children rode bikes down the sidewalk. Someone was grilling burgers 2 houses over. An elderly couple walked past, hand in hand, nodding hello. It was ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of moment that wouldn't make headlines or impress investors. It was everything. Elena thought about the billionaire she'd been, still was, technically, though the number seemed less important now. She thought about the blind date that wasn't blind, and the question that changed everything. You don't remember me, do you? She remembered now. She remembered all of it, and she was grateful, more grateful than she could say, that Daniel had given her the chance to remember who she'd been before the walls went up, before she forgot that connection was more valuable than success, and presence was more meaningful than power, and love, imperfect, difficult, terrifying love, was the only thing worth building. The streetlights came on, one by one. Daniel squeezed her hand. "Ready to go inside?" he asked. "In a minute. I want to stay here a little longer." "Any particular reason?" "No. I just want to be here. With you. In this moment." He smiled. That real smile. The one she'd learned to love. "Okay," he said. "I can do that." And they stayed. Two people who'd found each other across 23 years and 100 walls. Two people who'd learned that the greatest achievement wasn't what you built, but who you built it with. The night settled around them, soft and warm, and Elena felt, for the first time she could remember, like she was finally home.